You can do everything right with your container lettuce all spring long, and then one hot summer day you walk outside expecting fresh, crisp leaves, and instead you get a bitter taste that seems to appear overnight. Most people think insects caused it, or that the plant suddenly became too old to eat. I used to think the same thing. The surprising part is that the bitterness often starts long before you notice it, and one simple mistake in summer heat can turn a sweet container lettuce into something you no longer enjoy eating. The worst part is that many gardeners respond by adding more fertilizer or more water at the wrong time, and that usually makes the situation worse. If your lettuce tasted fine a few days ago and now tastes sharp and unpleasant, you are probably missing the real cause. What I am about to share is something that took me years to understand, and once I finally figured it out, my summer lettuce stayed productive much longer than before. Most people never notice this pattern because they focus on the leaves while the real problem is happening around the roots. Have you ever noticed how lettuce can look healthy and green but still taste bitter? That is where things get interesting. I learned this lesson after losing several containers of beautiful lettuce during a stretch of hot weather. From a distance, everything looked perfect. The leaves were large and the plants seemed healthy. Then I harvested a bowl for lunch, and the flavor was so bitter that nobody wanted to eat it. At first I blamed the variety. Then I blamed the weather. Then I blamed myself for not watering enough. But none of those explanations told the whole story. The truth was much simpler, and it is something many gardeners over 50 overlook because we are used to thinking about water only when plants start to wilt. Lettuce begins reacting to heat stress long before it falls over or shows obvious signs of trouble. By the time the leaves look stressed, the bitterness has often already started building inside the plant. This is why so many gardeners feel frustrated. They think the problem appeared overnight when in reality the plant was quietly warning them for days. The good news is that there is a very simple fix and it does not require expensive products or complicated equipment. In the next part, I will show you the hidden summer mistake that causes most of this bitterness and why even experienced gardeners keep repeating it year after year. The hidden mistake starts with something that looks completely harmless. A lot of gardeners place their lettuce containers where they receive the maximum amount of sun because that works beautifully in spring. The plants grow fast. The leaves stay tender. Everything seems perfect. Then summer arrives and the exact same location becomes a problem. I learned this many years ago when I had two containers sitting only a few feet apart. Both had the same lettuce variety. Both received the same fertilizer. Both were watered from the same hose. Yet one container produced sweet leaves while the other became bitter much earlier. At first, it made no sense. Then I started paying attention to what happened during the hottest part of the afternoon. That was when I noticed something most people miss. The container itself was becoming extremely hot. Not just warm, hot enough that I could barely keep my hand against the side for more than a few seconds. The lettuce leaves still looked green, but the roots were under stress every afternoon. Most people do not know this, but lettuce cares as much about root temperature as air temperature. When the roots spend hours sitting in overheated potting mix, the plant switches into survival mode. It begins preparing for difficult conditions. That change affects the flavor of the leaves. This is why bitterness often seems to appear suddenly after a few very hot days. The plant has been responding to stress the entire time. Here is where things get interesting. Many gardeners see the heat and start watering more often. Water is important, of course, but water alone does not solve overheated roots. In fact, I have seen people water 3 or 4 times a day and still end up with bitter lettuce because the container continued baking in direct afternoon sun. The real issue was not a lack of moisture. The real issue was excess heat trapped around the root zone. This changes everything because it means the solution is often much easier than people expect. You do not necessarily need a different fertilizer. You do not need expensive garden products. You do not need special lettuce varieties. What you need is a way to keep the roots cooler during the hottest hours. Many years ago, an older gardener showed me a simple trick that almost nobody talks about anymore. It cost practically nothing, and it immediately changed how my summer lettuce performed. Before I explain that forgotten method, there's another mistake that makes the problem even worse, and most gardeners make it without realizing it. The second mistake is so common that I still catch myself doing it if I am not paying attention. It happens when we look at the surface of the container and assume everything underneath is fine. I used to walk past my lettuce every morning and see dark, damp soil on top. That gave me confidence that the plants had plenty of moisture. Then, one particularly hot summer, I decided to check deeper in the container. What I found explained years of disappointment. The top inch looked moist, but several inches lower the potting mix was drying much faster than I expected. The roots were dealing with swings between wet and dry conditions while the plant sat in summer heat. Lettuce does not like those extremes. Most people think bitterness comes from one big problem, but in reality it often comes from several small stresses stacking together. Warm roots, uneven moisture, strong afternoon sun. None of them may seem severe on their own. Together they can change the flavor of the leaves surprisingly fast. Have you ever noticed that one harvest tastes excellent, and the next harvest from the same container tastes completely different? If this happened to you, you are not alone. I have seen it happen many times. What makes it frustrating is that the lettuce can still look healthy. The leaves may remain green and full. There may be no obvious warning signs. That is why so many gardeners blame the variety instead of the growing conditions. Here is where an old method comes into the story. An older gardener once told me that in summer he cared more about protecting the soil than feeding the plant. At first I thought he was exaggerating. Then he showed me something simple. He covered the surface of his containers with a light layer of natural mulch. Nothing fancy. No expensive products. Just enough material to reduce direct heat hitting the potting mix. The difference was noticeable. The soil stayed cooler. Moisture lasted longer. The plants handled hot afternoons with less stress. Most people do not do this with lettuce because they think mulch is only for larger vegetable gardens. That assumption costs them sweet harvests every summer. When I started using this old approach, my containers needed less frequent watering, and the lettuce stayed tender longer. But that was only part of the solution. The biggest improvement came from a small change in timing that I almost ignored because it seemed too simple to matter. Looking back, it was probably the most valuable lesson of all, and it is the reason some gardeners enjoy fresh lettuce deep into summer, while others give up much earlier. The change that made the biggest difference in my containers was not a product, and it was not a special gardening technique. It was timing. For years I watered whenever I had free time. Sometimes it was late morning. Sometimes it was in the afternoon. Sometimes it was close to sunset. I assumed water was water and that the exact hour did not matter very much. Then I began paying closer attention during a particularly hot season when my lettuce kept becoming bitter long before I expected. What I noticed was surprisingly simple. The containers that received a deep watering early in the morning handled the heat much better than the ones watered later in the day. At first, the difference seemed small. Then, week after week, the pattern continued. The morning watered lettuce remained sweeter and stayed productive longer. Most people do not know this because they focus on how much water they give their plants. They rarely think about when that water arrives. Early morning gives the roots a chance to absorb moisture before the strongest heat arrives. The plant starts the day prepared instead of struggling to catch up. When afternoon temperatures rise, the lettuce is already in a stronger position. This may sound like a small detail, but small details often separate disappointing harvests from successful ones. Here is where things get even more interesting. I also discovered that many gardeners accidentally create another problem by giving frequent shallow watering. The top layer becomes wet and looks good, but the deeper roots never receive the consistent moisture they need. As a result, the plant develops a weaker root system and becomes more sensitive to summer stress. I learned to water more deeply and less casually. That simple adjustment gave me better results than many fertilizers I had tried over the years. An older neighbor once told me that lettuce rewards consistency more than effort. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Now, I do. You do not have to work harder. You simply need to remove the unnecessary stress that the plant experiences every day. Many gardeners chase solutions after bitterness appears. The better approach is preventing the stress before the flavor changes. That is why I pay close attention to the first warm weeks of summer rather than waiting for problems to show up. But there is one more mistake that catches people off guard. In fact, this may be the reason some gardeners follow all the advice so far and still end up with bitter lettuce. It involves something growing right in front of them that they often mistake for a sign of success. The next mistake fooled me for years because it looked like a proof that my lettuce was thriving. The plants were growing fast. New leaves appeared constantly. The containers looked full and healthy. I remember feeling proud every time I walked past them. Then a few days later, the flavor changed and the bitterness returned. What I finally realized was that rapid growth during hot weather is not always a good sign. Sometimes the plant is trying to move into the next stage of its life much sooner than we expect. This is where many gardeners miss an important clue. Long before lettuce sends up a tall flower stalk, it begins preparing for that change internally. The plant senses heat. It senses longer days. It starts shifting its energy. When that process begins, the flavor often changes before the visual signs become obvious. Have you ever harvested lettuce that looked perfect but tasted completely different from the week before? That is often what is happening. Most people wait until they see clear signs of bolting. By then, the process is already well underway. I learned to watch for smaller signals. Leaves becoming slightly longer. Growth suddenly speeding up. The center looking more upright than usual. These are easy details to miss when you are busy. Yet they can tell you a great deal about what the plant is experiencing. Here is where an old forgotten habit helped me more than anything else. Years ago, an experienced gardener told me never to be afraid of harvesting earlier and more often. At first, I thought leaving lettuce untouched would allow me to get bigger harvests. In reality, the opposite was often true. Regular harvesting encouraged fresh growth and reduced the chance of ending up with a large container full of leaves that had already lost their best flavor. Many gardeners try to save their lettuce for one big harvest. I used to do exactly the same thing. The problem is that summer conditions can change quickly. A few hot days can turn excellent lettuce into disappointing lettuce. By harvesting steadily, you enjoy the plant while it is at its best. This approach costs nothing. It takes very little effort. Yet the results can be surprisingly noticeable. There is still debate among gardeners about the perfect harvesting schedule, but I can tell you what worked for me. Smaller harvests, taken more frequently, almost always gave me sweeter leaves during hot weather. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that ties everything together. Once I understood it, the entire problem of bitter summer lettuce became much easier to prevent year after year. The final piece of the puzzle is something so simple that many gardeners overlook it because they assume the solution must be more complicated. I certainly did. After years of experimenting with watering schedules, different varieties, fertilizers, and container sizes, I discovered that the biggest improvements often came from reducing stress rather than trying to increase growth. Most people spend their energy pushing lettuce to grow faster. The plant is usually telling us it needs the opposite. It needs protection from the harshest part of summer. One of the easiest methods I ever adopted was giving my containers afternoon shade during the hottest weeks. Not deep shade all day, just relief from the strongest sun. The first time I tried it, I honestly did not expect much. Lettuce is often described as a sun-loving crop, and I assumed more sunlight would always mean better results. What I learned changed the way I garden. During summer, the intense afternoon heat can do more damage than the extra sunlight helps. When I moved containers to a location where they received morning sun and some protection later in the day, the difference became hard to ignore. The soil stayed cooler, moisture lasted longer, The plants looked less stressed. Most importantly, the flavor stayed sweeter. Many people do not do this because they think moving containers is inconvenient, but that is one of the great advantages of container gardening. You can adjust conditions without rebuilding a garden bed or changing your entire setup. Sometimes shifting a container only a few feet can make a noticeable difference. An older gardener showed me another forgotten trick many years ago. He would place larger plants nearby so they cast light afternoon shade over his lettuce containers. It cost nothing and used space he already had. I still use that idea today. It is simple. It works. Very few people talk about it anymore. Here is where things become encouraging. You do not need to apply every tip at once. Even one or two of these changes can help reduce bitterness. Cooler roots, more consistent moisture, morning watering, light mulch, earlier harvesting, afternoon shade. Each one removes a little stress from the plant. Together, they create conditions where lettuce can stay tender much longer than most gardeners expect. When I finally understood this, summer lettuce stopped feeling unpredictable. I no longer wondered why the flavor changed overnight. I could usually see the warning signs before they became a problem. And there is one reason this matters even more than having better lettuce. It changes how you look at every container crop you grow. That is exactly what I want to talk about next as we bring everything together. When I look back at all the summers when my container lettuce turned bitter, I realize that the problem was rarely the lettuce itself. Most of the time, the plant was simply responding to conditions that I had not fully noticed. That understanding made gardening feel much easier and far less frustrating. Instead of constantly searching for a new fertilizer or a different variety, I started paying attention to the small signs that appeared before problems developed. Once I made that shift, my results became more consistent year after year. The good news is that none of the solutions we talked about require expensive equipment or complicated techniques. You do not need a large garden. You do not need special tools. You do not need to spend extra money every season. Most of these changes cost little or nothing at all. A layer of mulch, better watering habits, some afternoon shade, harvesting a little earlier. These are simple actions that almost anyone can take. That is one reason I like them so much. They fit into real life. Many of us do not have endless time to spend in the garden. We want methods that are practical and easy to repeat. What surprised me most was how quickly the results became noticeable. The lettuce stayed tender longer. The flavor remained milder. I harvested more leaves over a longer period. Instead of feeling disappointed when summer heat arrived, I felt prepared for it. If your lettuce has turned bitter before, do not assume you failed. Almost everyone gets this wrong at some point. I certainly did. In fact, many experienced gardeners continue making the same mistakes because the real causes are not always obvious. The important thing is recognizing that bitterness usually starts as a stress problem long before it becomes a flavor problem. Once you understand that, everything begins to make more sense. The next time a hot spell arrives, you will know what to watch for. You will notice the temperature around the containers. You will pay attention to moisture levels deeper in the potting mix. You will see the early signs of rapid growth and know what they mean. Little by little, those observations become habits, and those habits often lead to better harvests than any product you can buy. That is one of the lessons gardening has taught me over the years. The simplest solutions are often the ones people overlook, and once you see how much difference a few small adjustments can make with lettuce, you may start noticing similar opportunities throughout the rest of your garden. That is where things continue to get interesting, because every season teaches us something new if we are willing to pay attention.